That night, a cold wind blew between the towering buildings of New York City. Dim streetlights illuminated the narrow alleys, where the shadows of crime always lurked. In a corner of the city, rarely touched by the law, a street gang called the Vipers roamed, looking for victims to rob or extort. They were a group known for their ruthlessness, never hesitating to use violence to get what they wanted. That night, they believed they had found the perfect target, a tall, well-built man walking alone, without a trace of fear on his face. 5 gang members quickly surrounded the man as he entered a narrow alley near an old bar. Their leader, Marco, smirked slyly. "Hey, buddy! Cold night, huh? Why not share a little cash to warm us up?" he said mockingly. Tony, his right-hand man, pulled out a switchblade and began twirling it in the air, trying to intimidate. However, the man remained silent, his sharp eyes scanning each gang member surrounding him. Without realizing it, they had just provoked someone far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The man was Jack Carter, a former Navy SEAL who had undertaken countless dangerous missions in war zones. He had fought in the deadliest conflict areas, facing enemies far more trained and heavily armed. To him, 5 thugs wielding knives and clubs were no threat, just a bunch of kids who had no idea what they were up against. Jack took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He didn't want trouble, but if they forced his hand, he wouldn't hesitate to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Tony lost his patience and swung his knife toward Jack. But before the blade could even graze his skin, Jack had already moved. With lightning speed, he grabbed Tony's wrist and twisted it until a sickening crack echoed in the alley. Tony screamed in pain as his knife clattered to the ground. The other gang members were stunned, but instead of retreating, they grew furious and attacked all at once. Marco swung his club while the others tried to land blows on Jack from different angles. However, they were all far too slow for Jack. With movements honed over years of training, he dodged every attack effortlessly. He blocked Marco's club and countered with a powerful punch to his stomach, sending the gang leader stumbling backward, coughing violently. A swift kick struck another gang member in the chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Within seconds, the entire scene shifted. What had started as 5 against 1 had turned into one man standing over a group of battered, groaning men on the ground. Jack stood tall in the midst of them, his gaze cold, while the Vipers began to realize they had chosen the wrong target. Fear began to consume the remaining gang members. They had never imagined that the man they thought was an easy target was actually more dangerous than anyone they had ever faced. Marco, the gang leader, was still staggering after taking a powerful punch to his stomach. His breath was ragged, and cold sweat trickled down his forehead. "Damn! Who the hell are you?" he muttered in a hoarse voice. But Jack didn't answer. He simply stood tall, staring at them with a cold expression that made the tension even more suffocating. One of the gang members still on his feet, Ramon, tried to attack Jack from behind with an iron rod he had picked up from the ground. Fueled by revenge, he swung it with all his strength, hoping to land a blow on Jack's head. However, without even looking, Jack seemed to sense the attack coming. With incredible reflexes, he ducked just in time, letting the rod slice through nothing but air. Before Ramon could react, Jack grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, making the man scream in pain before slamming him brutally to the ground. His bones might not have broken, but he certainly wouldn't be using his arm properly for a while. Marco grew even more panicked. He knew that if they didn't escape immediately, things would only get worse. But his gang was already in no condition to fight. Tony was still groaning on the ground with his injured arm, while the others could barely stand. "We're getting out of here," he shouted, his voice trembling. But before he could take a step, Jack was already right in front of him. In one swift motion, Jack grabbed Marco's jacket collar and shoved him against the alley wall. Marco's eyes widened, his body trembling as he felt the overwhelming strength of the man he had just foolishly tried to challenge. Jack stared at Marco in silence for a few seconds, letting the fear seep into him. Then, in a low, chilling voice, he said, "You picked the wrong target. If I ever see you bothering anyone again, I won't be this merciful." The words were simple, but their effect was more terrifying than any threat Marco had ever heard. He could tell that the man before him was completely serious. This wasn't just a bluff, it was a final warning. If they tried something like this again, Jack wouldn't hesitate to end them without mercy. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, Jack released Marco and stepped back. Marco immediately collapsed to the ground, his hands trembling as he scrambled away. Jack glanced at the remaining gang members, who now could only look at him in sheer terror. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the alley, leaving them broken, not just physically but mentally as well. For the first time in their lives, the Vipers felt like small rats that had just come face to face with a lion. And they knew one thing for certain: they would never dare cross that man again. That night left a lasting mark on New York City's underground criminal world. News of a mysterious man who single-handedly destroyed the Vipers in mere minutes spread like wildfire. Criminals who once feared no one began treading carefully, afraid of accidentally targeting the wrong person. Jack Carter's name was never mentioned directly, but rumors of a ghost soldier who couldn't be defeated started turning into legend in the city's dark alleys. Even the thugs who once felt untouchable were now more cautious before choosing their next victim. Meanwhile, Jack continued living his life as usual. To him, what had happened that night was nothing extraordinary. He had no interest in becoming a street hero or gaining fame in the criminal world. All he wanted was peace after years of fighting on the battlefield. However, he also knew that the world wouldn't always allow someone like him to live in peace. Sooner or later, someone else would come to test his limits, whether it was another gang trying to prove itself or someone curious about the legends surrounding him. Marco and his gang were never seen committing crimes in their territory again. After that incident, they vanished from the streets, either out of fear or in search of a safer place. Those who once spread terror had now become the laughingstock of other gangs for being taken down by a single man. But behind the shame and the destruction of his gang, Marco carried a deeper feeling: gratitude that he was still alive. He knew that if Jack had truly wanted him dead that night, he wouldn't have had the chance to run. Even though Jack never intended to cause trouble, his presence had become something to be reckoned with. He had left a mark without meaning to, creating a story that would be told in the streets for years to come. Some saw him as a soldier seeking justice, while others viewed him as a threat greater than any gang that had ever ruled. But one thing was certain: for anyone who dared to challenge him, they had to be prepared to face something far more terrifying than just an ordinary fight. Because Jack Carter was no ordinary man. He was a nightmare that should never be awakened.